Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 142, December 4th to December 10th, 1863. Last week, we had the conclusion to the Chattanooga campaign. Patrick Cleburne will be doing an excellent job saving the Confederate Army and supplies at Ringgold Gap, his command being clearly the shining star in an otherwise dimly lit Southern effort. Braxton Bragg was officially removed from command of the Army of Tennessee, his latest resignation being accepted. We concluded with the siege and then assault efforts on Knoxville, which ended in a bloody repulse for the Confederates. This week, we're going to talk John Hunt Morgan's escape from federal prison, talk a little bit about the Knights of the Golden Circle, and read from the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Of course, before we do that, we do need to talk about Patreon content, and we did a movie review that should be posted here to the Patreon feed. That's going to be Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. So for the holiday season, we're doing something a little bit different, right? It's probably not the movie you think of when you're thinking of historically accurate movies, but just to watch that one and try to pick some things apart, I think you're going to find it at least interesting, a good change of pace compared to some of these other movies we've been doing. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. On December 8th, we have the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which is going to be part of Lincoln's plan to restore the Union once the war is over. We usually think of Reconstruction as a post-war kind of thing, and you'd be right, that is what the period is known as, but we should point out that Lincoln's administration is already thinking about a way in which to end the war, and then what's going to happen afterward. It probably seemed like a good time with the Trans-Mississippi in check, Bragg soundly defeated, and Lee stalemated in Virginia. In a way, this will be extending a hand to the Southern populace, who might have feared otherwise harsher reprisals. Let's read from the statement, and then we can discuss. I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, do proclaim, declare, and make known to all persons who have, directly or by implication, participated in the existing rebellion, except as hereinafter accepted, that a full pardon is hereby granted to them, and each of them, with restoration of all rights of property, except as to slaves, and in property cases where rights of third parties shall have intervened, and upon the condition that every such person shall take and subscribe an oath, and henceforward keep and maintain said oath inviolate, and which oath shall be registered for permanent preservation, and shall be the tenor and effect following to with. I, and this is where they would state their name and the taking of the oath, do solemnly swear in presence of Almighty God that I will henceforth faithfully support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the States thereunder, and that I will, in like manner, abide and faithfully support all acts of Congress passed during the existing rebellion with reference to slaves, so long and so far as not repealed, modified, or held void by Congress, or by decision of the Supreme Court, and that I will, in like manner, abide by and faithfully support all proclamations of the President made during the existing rebellion, having reference to slaves, so long and so far as not modified or declared void by decision of the Supreme Court, so help me God. The persons accepted from the benefits of the foregoing provisions are all who are or shall have been civil or diplomatic officers or agents of the so-called Confederate government, all who have left judicial stations under the United States to aid the rebellion, all who or shall have been military or naval officers of said so-called Confederate government above the rank of colonel in the Army or of lieutenant in the Navy, who left seats in the United States Congress to aid rebellion, all who resigned commissions in the Army or Navy of the United States and afterwards aided the rebellion, all who have engaged in any way in treating colored persons or white persons in charge of such otherwise than lawfully as prisoners of war, and which persons have been found in the United States, service as soldiers, seamen, or in other capacity. And I do further proclaim, declare, and make known that whenever in any of the states of Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina, a number of persons not less than 1/10 in number of the votes cast in such state at the presidential election of the year of our Lord 1860, each having taken the oath aforesaid, and not having since violated it, and being a qualified voter by the election laws of the state existing immediately before the so-called act of secession, and excluding all others, shall reestablish a state government which shall be republican, and in no wise contravening said oath, such shall be recognized as the true government of the state, and the state shall receive thereunder the benefits of the constitutional provision which declares that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. And I do further proclaim, declare, and make known that in any provision which may be adopted by such state government in relation to the freed people of such state, which shall recognize and declare their permanent freedom, provide for their education, and which may yet be consistent as a temporary arrangement with their present condition as a laboring, landless, and homeless class, will not be objected to by the national executive. And it is suggested as not improper that, in constructing a loyal state government in any state, the name of the state, the boundary, the subdivisions, the constitution, and the general code of laws, as before the rebellion, be maintained, subject only to the modifications made necessary by the conditions herein before stated, and such others, if any, not contravening said conditions, and which may be deemed expedient by those framing the new state government. To avoid misunderstanding, it may be proper to say that this proclamation, so far as it relates to state governments, has no reference to states wherein loyal state governments have all the while been maintained. And therefore, for the same reason, it may be proper to further say that whether members sent to Congress from any state shall be admitted to seats constitutionally rests exclusively with the respective houses, and not to any extent with the executive. And still further, that this proclamation is intended to present the people of the states wherein the national authority has been suspended and loyal state governments have been subverted, a mode in and by which the national authority and loyal state governments may be reestablished within said states or in any of them, and while the mode presented is the best the executive can suggest with his present impressions, it must not be understood that no other possible mode would be acceptable. Given under my hand at the city of Washington, the 8th day of December, A.D. 1863, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 88th. Abraham Lincoln. So there's a lot to unpack there. The gist is that the Southern people who take a loyalty oath will be pardoned, and property, of course, minus any enslaved individuals, would be restored. You may have caught there as well that if 10% of the populace, or at least the voting populace anyway, has accepted the oath, then a state government could be reestablished. Hence, we have the alternative name for this proclamation, the 10% plan. We mentioned the loyalty oath in terms of guerrilla activity and irregular warfare, and we also mentioned Lincoln's goal of establishing state governments, which would hopefully allow for more to come back into the fold of the Union, especially with representation now. States' rights and proper representation we talked about a long while back, so obviously to placate was a good strategy. It's also interesting if you look at the verbiage and read it, it is talking a lot as well about how the war is definitely that of rebellion, right? There's not actually a new state or a new country called the Confederate States of America. It's very clear in that, right? Another interesting thing that I think, especially in connection with certain individuals, high-ranking individuals, right? It doesn't necessarily include everyone who can take the oath. So obviously Jefferson Davis wouldn't be able to take the short trip up to Washington, D.C., take the oath, and then just be okay, right? So there are certain individuals who this would not apply to. We talked about how John Singleton Mosby is kind of teetering on the fence toward the end of the war, because he doesn't know whether he's going to be able to be given these rights, and he might just be treated like a criminal or a prisoner of war, shall we say, right? And so that's a problem here that we'll cross when we get into 1865, of course. But especially as we talk about how there are these campaigns into southern occupied states, Louisiana, Arkansas, we have mentioned some of those so far, right? And they listed off a whole bunch of states where there is a foothold, a Union foothold. The point is, we're going to try to get the Southern populace to come back into the Union. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal. Everything is going to go back to the way it was before, except, right, there's going to be no slavery anymore, right? That's sort of the big one here they keep talking about, but everything goes back to normal. You get your voting rights back. So overall, it's actually a pretty sweet deal, and a lot of individuals are going to be trying to take advantage of it. Lastly, it would also encourage the Southerners to then deal with the newly freedmen, and of course, they would not be able to hinder on their earned freedom. There were radical Republicans that would seek harsher measures for the Southern states to regain their positions into the Union. A bill, the Wade-Davis bill, would be created and then pocket vetoed by Lincoln. Considering that Benjamin Wade is a name we have at least maybe briefly mentioned as being part of the Committee on the Conduct of the War, and Henry Winter Davis being from Maryland and influential for abolition in that state, it should not surprise us that they put together something that would in fact be harsher. It was contentious, being voted 18-14 before Lincoln stepped in with several objections, including that the bill demanded the Southern states to draft new constitutions abolishing slavery, which, interestingly enough, was unconstitutional at this time. We will continue to see how these plans affect things moving forward, so let's just keep that in the back of our heads. Let's talk at least a little bit about the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, maybe you have seen National Treasure 2, and maybe you think there is a secret organization still out there called the Knights of the Golden Circle, and far be it from me to burst that bubble, but we should at least get some context into the real Knights of the Golden Circle back in the 1800s. In 1854, the order was founded by George Bickley, who would become a surgeon in the Confederate Army. In the 1850s, the organization was more linked with the same goals that filibusters had, expansion of Southern territory, and of course, primarily the Southern territory expanding with the thought of slavery on the mind. While we mentioned a planned annexation of Cuba, there was much more on the plate of the new empire, which included Mexico and Central America. Once the Golden Circle was created, then there would be an empire which included such cities as Mexico City, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. Now, membership in the order was not exactly a secret, but obviously when the war began, there was a lot of finger-pointing, especially at the Copperheads in the North, who were thought to be members of this order. It would maybe surprise you to know that at one point there were several thousand members, Bickley actually promising a large army to invade Mexico with. The last of these attempts, or at least the planning of such, was hatched in 1860, so we are talking right up to the beginning of the war. There were castles or storehouses throughout the South which had supplies and weapons, and there were some operations in motion that were actually put on pause after Fort Sumter. The name of the game would be then to not expand American territory, but to defeat the Union, gain independence, and then launch an assault on the desired territory we already mentioned. As you could imagine, the French intervention into Mexico might well have thrown a Napoleon III-sized wrench into these plans, but step one would have to be completed anyway, as it usually does. Interestingly, there were different wings in the order, which included military, commercial, and financial, and political, so we have all facets of a successful New World Order covered. Now, as you could also imagine, this would all benefit the rich, large, plantation-owning upper class, so it would be hard to necessarily recruit outside of that niche. In fact, there were those who, of course, were not turned off from the potential destruction of the Union, even before the Confederacy was formed. For that reason, believing that the Knights could operate effectively in the North to be a kind of secret service is far-fetched, although Stanton did believe there was a plot and maybe They were in the deep conceptual phase, as we call it, to make some moves in the North, right? Additionally, there were the Sons of Liberty, an offshoot or rebranding of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which did include some copperheads, for their activities were not so much treasonous as it was simply they talked a whole lot. There had been at least the idea of seizing Lincoln and allowing Breckinridge to be installed as a president before the outbreak of hostilities, Breckinridge reportedly being a member of the Knights. Most of the Knights would simply serve in the Confederate Armed Forces. After the war, there was a smattering of activity, but not so much evidence to support continued active operations. So we need to talk about John Hunt Morgan escaping from prison. When we concluded his raid into Ohio, the rebels had been defeated at Buffington Island, with many taken prisoner. Despite maybe an attempt for Morgan to make it back to Southern lines, he would opt to remain with the men who were trapped in Northern territory. As a result, he too was captured and then sent to prison. While most of his enlisted men would find their way to Camp Douglas, Morgan and the rest of his officers would be housed in the Ohio Penitentiary. The reason for this was that the governor of Ohio would petition Burnside, as the property of the state had been damaged. We can maybe connect this with just how much the raid affected the civilian population. While not the most militarily effective, the raid did sap Union strength, increase Confederate morale, and of course was a strike of fear into Indiana and Ohio, states that besides the Heartland Campaign of 1862 had really not been threatened. Ironically, as we have mentioned with prisoner of war camps, being housed in the prison was a stroke of luck for the officers, who received some better treatment. It was not without its harsh moments, however. As we have highlighted, the prisoners were considered more criminals than enemy combatants. Solitary confinement was the name of the game for those who disobeyed the rules. Food would decrease in quality, and mail would be tampered with. Thomas Hines, a scout and future spy, would come up with a plan. Hines will hatch a plan to maybe free additional Confederate prisoners, setting them loose in northern states so that they could wreak some general havoc and maybe establish some kind of new Northwest government via Copperhead support, and that kind of ties very nicely into what we were talking about just moments ago. Despite acting covertly throughout the war, Hines was unable to show anything. Spending some time in Canada after the war, the former Confederate agent would become a Chief Justice in Kentucky later in life. It would actually be Hines who would leave a first-hand account of the escape, which was written after the war. In 1863, he would notice that the floor to his cell was always dry, confirming by talking to a guard that there was in fact an air duct underneath. Here, of course, we have his account. I had observed that the ground upon the outside of the building, which was low and flat, and also that the floor of the cell was perfectly dry and free from mold. It occurred to me that as the rear of the cell was to a great extent excluded from the light of air, this dryness and freedom from mold could not exist unless there was underneath something in the nature of an air chamber to prevent the dampness from rising up the walls and through the floor. If this chamber should be found to exist and could be reached, a tunnel might be run through the foundations into the yard, from which we might escape by scaling the outer wall. The air chamber furnishing a receptacle from the earth and stone to be taken out in running the tunnel. The next morning, when our cells were unlocked and we were permitted to assemble in the hall, I went to General Morgan's cell, he having been for several days quite unwell, and laid before him the plan as I have sketched it. Its feasibility appeared to him unquestioned, and to it he gave a hearty and unqualified approval. If then our supposition was correct as to the existence of the air chamber beneath the lower range of cells, a limited number of those occupying that range could escape, and only a limited number, because the greater the number, the longer the time required to complete the work, and the greater the danger of discovery, while prosecuting it, in making our way over the wall and escaping afterwards. With these considerations in view, General Morgan and myself agreed upon the following officers whose cells were nearest to the point at which the tunnel was to begin, to join us in this enterprise. Captain J.C. Bennett, Captain L.D. Hockersmith, Captain C.S. McGee, Captain Ralph Sheldon, and Captain Samuel B. Taylor. The plan was then laid before these gentlemen and received their approval. It was agreed that work should begin in my cell and continue from there until completed. In order, however, to do this without detection, it was necessary that some means should be found to prevent the daily inspection of that cell, it being the custom for the deputy warden with the guards to visit and have each cell swept every morning. This end was accomplished by my obtaining permission from the warden to furnish a broom and sweep my own cell. For a few mornings thereafter, the deputy warden would pass, glance into my cell, compliment me on its neatness, and go on with the inspection of the other cells. After a few days, my cell was allowed to go without any inspection whatever, and then we were ready to begin work, having obtained through some of our associates who had been sent to the hospital some table knives made of flat steel files. In my cell, as in the others, there was a narrow iron cot which could be folded and propped up to the cell wall. I thought the work could be completed within a month. On the 4th of November, work was begun in the back part of my cell, under the rear end of my cot. We cut through 6 inches of cement and took out 6 layers of brick, put in and cemented with the ends up. Here we came to the air chamber, as I had calculated, and found it 6 feet wide by 4 feet high, and running the entire length of the range of cells. The cement and brick taken out and effecting an entrance to the chamber were placed in my bed tick, upon which I slept during the progress of this portion of the work, and after which the material was removed to the chamber. We found the chamber heavily grated at the end, against which a large quantity of coal had been heaped, cutting off any chance of exit in that way. We then began a tunnel, running it at right angles from the side of the chamber and almost directly beneath my cell. We cut through the foundation wall, 5 feet thick, of the cell block, through 12 feet of grouting to the outer wall of the east wing of the prison, through this wall 6 feet in thickness, and 4 feet up near the surface of the yard, in an unfrequented place between the wing and the female department of the prison. So we see that working on their particular cells, the rebel prisoners would sharpen knives to try to dig their way out. A close call would occur when one of the diggers was not present at mess. Morgan, thinking quickly to allow for the missing man to get back to his cell by distracting the guards. During the progress of this work, in which we were greatly assisted by several of our comrades who were not to go out, I sat at the entrance to my cell, studiously engaged on Gibbon's Rome in trying to master French. By this device I was enabled to be constantly on guard without being suspected, as I had pursued the same course during the whole period of my imprisonment. Those who did the work were relieved every hour. This was accomplished, and the danger of the guards overhearing the work as they passed obviated by adopting a system of signals, which consisted in giving taps on the floor over the chamber. 1 knock was to suspend work, 2 to proceed, and 3 to come out. On one occasion, by oversight, we came near being discovered. The prisoners were taken out to their meals by ranges, and on this day those confined in the first range were called for dinner, while Captain Hockersmith was still in the tunnel. The deputy warden, on calling the roll, missed Hockersmith, and came back to inquire for him. General Morgan engaged the attention of the warden by asking his opinions as to the propriety of the remonstrance that the general had prepared to be sent to General Burnside. Flattered by the deference shown to his opinion by General Morgan, the warden unwittingly gave Captain Hockersmith time to get out and fall into line for dinner. While the tunnel was being run, Colonel R.C. Morgan, brother of General Morgan, made a rope in lengths of bed ticking, 30 feet in length, and from the iron poker of the hall stove we made a hook in the nature of a grappling iron to attach to the end of this rope. So if you think this sounds like stuff out of movies, it sort of is. Hines was inspired by Les Mis, and Morgan referred to him as the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a pretty good insight into the romantic kind of views these men had, influenced by classics of literature. A member of the escaping party would actually talk to the warden and then scale a ladder under the guise of a feat of strength, to then view where the best place to scale the wall would be. Morgan and Hines were among 7 who would make the escape, Morgan switching places with his brother as part of the ruse. Additionally, civilian clothes and currency was smuggled into the prison, probably things that would not be possible in a POW camp. November 27th would prove to be their attempt date. Luckily, this was also a rainy night, negating the dogs and the sentries who chose to stay dry instead. Digging through the pre-cut holes, the prisoners would leave dummies in their beds to fool any inspections. Here we have Hines' account again. At the appointed hour, Taylor gave the signal. Each of us arranged his cot, with the seat in his cell so as to represent a sleeping prisoner, and easily breaking the thin layer of cement, descended to the chamber, passed through the tunnel, breaking through the thin stratum of earth at the end. We came out near the wall of the female prison. It was raining slightly. Crawled by the side of the wall to the wooden gate, cast our grappling iron attached to the rope over the gate, made it fast, ascended to the rope to the top of the gate, drew up the rope, and made our way by the wing wall to the outside wall, where we entered a sentry box, and divested ourselves of our soiled outer garments. In the daytime, sentries were placed on this wall, but at night they were on the inside of the walls, and at the main entrance to the prison. On the top of the wall we found a cord running along the outer edge and connecting with a bell to the office of the prison. This cord General Morgan cut with one of the knives we had used in tunneling. Before leaving my cell, I wrote and left an address to N. Marion, the warden, the following. Hines actually then gives a little note about the labor, the man hours that it took to make this tunnel, make this escape, right? And he also leaves a little note in French as well for the warden. So very, like I said, very romantic. Scaling the wall, the party would scatter, Hines and Morgan taking a train to get out of the city. Reportedly, a Union major sat next to Morgan and shared some brandy with him, making the story that much more fantastic. We do, of course, have Hines on that account as well. Having removed all trace of soil from our clothes and persons, we attached the iron hook to the railing on the outer edge of the wall and descended to the ground within 60 yards of where the prison guards were sitting round a fire and conversing. Here we separated, General Morgan and myself going to the depot, about a quarter of a mile from the prison, where I purchased 2 tickets for Cincinnati, and entered the car that just then came in. General Morgan took a seat by the side of a federal major in uniform, and I sat immediately in the rear. The general entered into conversation with the major, who was made the more talkative by a copious drink of my French brandy. As the train passed near the prison wall where we had descended, the major remarked, "There is where the rebel officer General Morgan and his officers are being put for safekeeping." General replied, "I hope they will keep him as safe as he is now." Our train passed through Dayton, Ohio, and there, for some unknown reason, we were delayed an hour. This rendered it extra hazardous to go to the depot in the city of Cincinnati, since by that time the prison officials would, in all probability, know of our escape, and telegraph to intercept us. In fact, they did not telegraph in every direction, and offered a reward for our recapture. Instead, then, of going to the depot in Cincinnati, we got off, while the train was moving slowly in the outskirts of the city, near Ludlow Ferry on the Ohio River. Going directly to the ferry, we were crossed over in a skiff and landed immediately in front of the residence of Mrs. Ludlow. We rang the doorbell, a servant came, and General Morgan wrote upon a visiting card, "General Morgan and Captain Hines escaped." We were warmly received, took a cup of coffee with the family, were furnished a guide, and walked some 3 miles in the country, where we were furnished horses. So we see they eventually make it back into Kentucky, staying in friendly dwellings, and then eventually arriving at Dalton, Georgia. Unfortunately, Morgan's wife would die after giving birth to a child on the same night as his daring escape. The escape itself, though, would be another boost to Southern morale, especially after the setbacks in the region. So Morgan, while not quite as effective a cavalry officer afterwards, would prove useful in the raid and then the escape. With that, we can go ahead and call it a day. We had a little bit of odds and ends episode, probably a nice break from our recent campaigning. Lincoln would release the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. We talked about the Knights of the Golden Circle, and we backtracked for John Hunt Morgan escaping from federal prison. Next week, we need to return to Tennessee, where we will continue Longstreet's adventures, as well as check in on what's going on in Virginia, as well as Louisiana. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon and Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.